Hey there, everybody. Thanks for joining me for another one-man review. Today, I'll be taking a look at Tim Hensley's Detention number 2, which has a story in it called Maggie, a Girl of the Streets by Stephen Crane. Now, when I read this, I didn't understand that Maggie of the Streets was a real story by a real guy named Stephen Crane. I thought this was all entirely fictional. Before I recorded this, I said, I better go look that up, because there is kind of a Charles Dickens time period since this whole thing that I found strange. So I wanted to look that up to make sure it's not fake, which I assumed it was when I was reading this. So maybe my understanding of this book is a little tainted by the fact that I thought Stephen Crane was a fiction and that this entire thing was just Tim Hensley operating under a pseudonym, because his name doesn't appear anywhere on the cover, front or back or inside, I don't think, other than the very, very back of the book. So it's presented as like a Stephen Crane project, really, which left me a bit confused. I guess that's partially because I don't know what it is going into it, which is on purpose. I don't like to know what things are going in. I like the work to explain that to me. But this doesn't even have anything on it inside, like on the inside back cover. It doesn't have anything basically on the back that says what this all is. So it's hard to tell. It's really, this whole book is hard for me to tell what I make of it, other than that it's beautifully drawn, phenomenal cartooning, but I just don't quite understand what it is as a project. So the most that I can make of it is that this is a fictional, this is issue number 2 of a fictional comic series called Detention, that is, because there are no other issues of Detention available, this is just a one-off. So I think that Tim Hensley has created a fictional old comic, something that would have been published in like the 50s or 60s, 40s, whenever, that is supposed to be reprints, illustrated reprints of classics for kids to read while they're in detention. I think that's what this is supposed to be, which is such a weird, wild thing. I mean, it makes sense that you would like use graphic fiction to teach the bad kids, but I don't know. It's just such a strange object to make. So I'm just not totally sure what I feel about this project. And then there's some really interesting stuff. Like here you have the dunce, which I'm assuming is kind of like the Crypt Keeper character for this series. This is, this character that comes in and kind of sets up the issue and has a little gag strip in the front and the back, but has nothing to do with the rest of the story. So I'm assuming the dunce would be in issue number 1 and number 3 and number 4 if those actually existed, which they don't. Then you get a really interesting bit here at the bottom. That this strip is basically pretty educational, informational, talking about a pigment called Chile's green, which was made of a mix of arsenic and copper and made a really nice, vivid green pigment, but it was poisoning a lot of people. And they say that even Napoleon died from inhaling that. And there's a suggestion, too, that there was a story written about it, about a lady getting poisoned by the wallpaper. And it says it's by C.P. Gilman. I don't know if they're referring to the yellow wallpaper story, which is one of the scariest stories I've ever written, but I don't think that's the right name of the author. But if that yellow wallpaper story is about someone going mad from poisonous wallpaper, that makes a lot of sense. It makes that story kind of funnier the way people interpret it now. So anyways, we get to the meat of the book, which is the Maggie, a Girl on the Streets by Stephen Crane. And this is, I haven't read it, but there is an actual Stephen Crane who wrote an actual Maggie, a Girl of the Streets, sometime in the late 1800s. So you basically get this social tragedy that's represented here, and with the cartooning almost looks like a piece of satire, which is strange, because when I was just reading through this, not knowing it was an adaptation, I was thinking, oh, this is a really strange attempt to like imbue cartooning with literature, which, like literature in the old sense. And that's why it feels like an old Charles Dickens or something, like someone doing social realism as literature and then bringing that into this cartoon adaptation style of, like a Casper the Ghost comic. Which is a really strange, it makes sense once you think about it, but it's a really strange conclusion to come to. And I have a pretty hard time just like I have a hard time buying into the social realism aspect of the story with the very silly cartooning going on. So I don't know that those two things quite mesh, and I'm not 100% certain what exactly uh, Tim Hensley is up to. Like, why did he make this? It's a beautifully rendered book, but I'm just not sure about the why. Why someone would make a fake, you know, fake book to read in detention of old literature that, as far as I can tell, is not very popular because I've never heard of it. You know, what he found in this story that he wanted to illustrate. But anyways, we'll look at the story. So Maggie, a Girl of the Street, starts off in the past relative to the rest of the story. We meet her brother Jimmy and a group of other characters here that are like basically the kids in the area. I don't know either where exactly this is supposed to be happening. We get introduced to Jimmy and Pete here. I don't know if this is happening in New England or if this is happening in England or in Ireland. There's a weird like dialect throughout, some kind of accent that's being it puts mutter out when yous come home half dead. So I'm thinking it's supposed to be somewhere in New England in like the in the tenements in the late 1800s. Anyways, that's my assumption. It's a little bit obnoxious to read the dialect, but I get it. It gives it a flavor. But I think it's supposed to be kind of like a Boston accent. I'm not sure. Anyways, Jimmy's out getting in fights with Pete here. Pete's on the other team, I guess. And Grandpa comes in. I think it's Grandpa or Dad, but it looks like Grandpa comes in and grabs him, brings him back. Then you meet his sister, Maggie, who's the titular heroine. And you come back and meet Grandma, and they get in trouble. And so you learn a little bit about their past. And then pretty quickly, you see that they had a rough past, basically. And then you get a big time jump here, and now you're in the future, and Jimmy has become a young man of leather. His sneer became chronic, so he's kind of a brawler out in the streets. He despised obvious Christians and ciphers with chrysanthemums of aristocracy in their buttonholes. And then Maggie blossomed in a mud puddle. The girl Maggie blossomed in the mud puddle. That's a weird way to write it. I guess she's a rose in the mess. She grew to be a rare production of the tenement district, a purdy girl. So that's what you have, is you have kind of her roughneck brother, and then her being the pretty girl. They're living in the dire circumstances of the tenement, and they're looking for ways out. This character, Pete, comes back into play. Jimmy's now kind of made friends with Pete and introduces Maggie to his old friend Pete. And Pete basically takes Maggie out on a date. The date causes rumors that Maggie is sleeping around with Pete, and so Jimmy gets all worked up. Maggie's name has been besmirched. What is that devil Pete doing with her? So he goes out looking for them. He's got to defend his sister's honor. Grandma's or mom is all mad. Well, I didn't mean to show that page, but there's a big fight at the bar. At the bar, Pete runs into a woman, Nellie, who she remembers, and Nellie is represented in a kind of Osamu Tezuka type of cute style. So she's supposed to be extra cute, and Pete gets very interested in her and goes over to her, and Maggie gets left with her date at the table while they go dancing. Then that character gets drunk. We run into a throwback to the kid in the yellow dress, or whatever that very first comic's called. It's kid in the yellow dress, right? And with the same lettering on the dress and all that. That's just a shout out to that. It doesn't have any real place in the story. So a lot of this just seems like undue nostalgia to me. Maybe that's where I have a problem with it, is it's old like Dickinson era writing, drawn in the style of like the first comics that were coming along, referencing them at least, drawn in the style of like old Casper the Ghost Key comics and things like that. I just don't know what the mix is supposed to add up to, other than just someone who has a nostalgia for all that stuff. Anyways, story-wise, Maggie comes home. She gets kicked out, even though she hasn't really done anything bad, and so that actually sends her on the streets, and she doesn't have any place to stay. So she turns to prostitution. finds that it's actually really hard to secure John, even though she's one of the rare attractive women in the tenement. Hooks up with this extremely unsavory character here, and because we're in a cartoony nostalgia fest, they die by having a piano dropped on their head, which I'm assuming is in the actual story itself, but it's just kind of like such a cartoon mechanism physics cliche that like this tragic story of this woman raised in this awful tenement environment, and she finally, after all of these kind of interpersonal relationships go wrong, which really we're in a 34-page story, so we haven't had time to get to really delve into any of that in a way that matters at all. She has a piano drop on her head and gets crushed in an old like cartoon slapstick punchline. So this tragedy is now like even more satiric just because of the cartooning style that's applied. But again, it's beautiful. It looks amazing. It was decently fun to read, but I just don't know the why of it. Other than here, again, you go back to read Detention, in detention, and dismember more of them matriculations. So really, this whole thing is just that really, I think Hensley's desire to create a fake comic book, I think that would have been more easy to accept as a reader if it hadn't been in this big format with really nice Fantagraphics production. If this would have been this well printed and produced, but like the Santos brothers do with their books, to make it feel like an actual old comic book, I think that would, the Santos sisters comics, the Santos brothers, the comic, the Santos sisters is printed that way to look like an old comic, or what Jay Stevens does with Dwellings, things like that, where it's printed on a kind of newsprinty paper. I think the whole reason for this existing seems to be to have this false object from this nostalgic past of being in detention reading comics or something, but it doesn't really feel like that object. So it's a beautiful piece of cartooning. The writing's okay. I don't think that it syncs very well. I don't think that the style of writing or story that's being told here syncs up with this type of cartooning. I think it's a very strange way to try and make cartoons seem literate by going back to literature a long time ago instead of literature now. So I don't think it does its job of trying to make cartoons seem more literate. In fact, it seems to be purposely doing the opposite of that, leaning more on the cartooning and less on the literature. Because, when you get these adaptations of literature, especially older ones, they were never very good. So it kind of has that vibe to it of like, it's not the greatest adaptation, or this isn't the perfect story for the format. I don't know if that was all intentional or what, but it's just a weird product for me. Then you get a couple more educational things here. So you get Jake Reese, Muckraker, which I'm assuming is also, given the fact that Stephen Crane's a real person, that this is a real story about the guy who invented photojournalism. It seems like someone who's going and doing flash photography of the places that he was writing stories about, even using a pan here, because he started out having people shoot guns for the flash, and that scared too many people, even though he warned them. So then he started using a flash in the pan, and that's where you would get that terminology, the flash in a pan. So there's educational stuff, and I would have preferred that it was a whole book of this kind of stuff, honestly, because that's more interesting to me. And then again, you get this really weird, like, undermining yourself thing that Tim Hensley does here, where he then goes to make a biographical bit about Stephen Crane. And again, when I was reading this, there was nothing in here to suggest this was an actual person, other than the fact that they're treating it as an actual person. But my assumption is that this is all a pseudonym that Tim Hensley was working under. So when I read this, I just thought this was all fictional. But apparently it's real. But that gets confused by the fact that, oh, here's Stephen Crane. Okay, well, I'm Stephen Crane. I help industry hoist and scoop. Au contraire, it is I, not even human, who most apropos embodies the moniker. So we've got cranes to fill in for Stephen Crane as like some kind of weird visual pun joke to tell his history. and then we'll switch between the two. So I don't know what that, like, why, they're just kind of randomly switching between the two. And then when you switch to this page here, basically Crane is dead, and then you get more of his story. And the suggestion is that I'm not pantomiming all the way through Hart Crane now that you've done Stephen. So apparently Stephen had a relative, or there's someone else named Hart Crane. So I don't know how any of that connects to anything. And then you get the employees of Classics Illustrated, and this is supposed to be like the credits for who did this. And again, that makes sense in the context of this fictional object that this is supposed to be, but still pretty strange. And then you basically have Jack Kirby here, and is he the one who supposedly drew this? It doesn't look like Jack Kirby, but this is supposed to be the staff of the Classics Illustrated, and he's the freelancer. So I don't know. There's just a lot jumbled in here. Then you get another little strip here about Romeo and Juliet, Julius Caesar, things like that. And then you have this piece on the back that, again, I don't know what it is. Is it just Tim Hensley being a cartoonist, or is this based on a song, The Bride Comes to Yellow Sky, or another short story? I don't know. So in the end, for only $20, I find this to be a very confusing art object. If you were trying to really hit at that nostalgia, I think it would have been better to produce this at the size of an actual old comic book, on the closest you could get to newsprint, and keep it cheap, or at least have like a fake price on it or something, because only $20, like, no one's reading a book that costs only $20 in Detention. So I don't know. Tim Hensley's an amazing cartoonist, but I just really don't know what to make of the writing. I feel like there's a couple artists in that category for me, Tim Hensley being one, Rich Tommaso being another, where their cartooning is just off the charts amazing, but I just don't know what the hell to make of their nostalgia, or what they're trying to say as artists. It just seems to me like these artists aren't saying anything, that they just are really good cartoonists, and they just want a cartoon, and they feel like they have to justify it in some more, quote, clever package. But I don't see the clever. It just kind of falls apart. Or it could have been, the package itself could have been more tailored towards what it was. So yeah, again, phenomenal art all throughout, but I just really, I don't know what to make of this. I'm curious. I've got Sir Alfred on order coming to me, and I'm curious to see what that is and how that relates to this, because it's another one of those, like, one out of a series of something. So maybe there's a bigger project here that I don't see, about all these comics that never were, and maybe that will add up to something more. But as it stands, I'm just not quite sure what to make of this. So I know this is an older book. I'd be curious, people who have watched this, if you think I'm missing out on something. I would love to hear what I'm missing out on in terms of this. Or if there's other things I need to look at before I form an opinion, I'd love to hear from you. And then for people who are considering buying it, like, that's the product. And it's, if you're in it for the cartooning, buy it. It's beautiful. If you're in it for a story, I don't know, you'll have to make up your own mind. If you enjoy what we're doing here on the channel and you want to support us, there's two ways to do that. The first way is through our Patreon. There's 2 tiers of interaction on there. At the first tier, you can get early access to the videos. At the second tier, you get exclusive access to the books that Sean and I are working on, our private projects, things like that, as well as the ability to participate in our ongoing webcomic experiment, Pronade, where you can help determine what goes on with the story there. Any of the funds that we make from the Patreon just go back into buying the books that we review. So that just helps us keep this whole thing going and lets us put some money back into the industry, other creators, other publishers' pockets. So if you want to support Living the Line itself, the best thing to do is to support what Sean's doing with Living the Line Publishing. So go ahead and take a look at one of his books now. Sala Niyalo, Path of the Shades by Clarence Doss is a really cool ongoing project that Living the Line will be producing. Clarence is a PhD student from Fiji who's studying the myths of Fiji for his doctoral thesis. And part of that study project is that he's producing these comics. They're kind of like Hellboy, where there's these little short stories that capture all of these different mythologies. But then he's using that to wrap the project into his doctoral thesis, and then provide educational material where people can come to these comics. They don't have to read his PhD thesis. They can come to the comics and get a more consumable version of the mythology of Fiji. Thanks for following along. Take it away, Jack.
You want to see all these books? Smash that subscribe button and the like button and the bell, and then you get them.